So how did I get from this to this? Keep watching and I'll show you how. First, I measured my husband's head circumference with his wig on to get an accurate measurement. I used that circumference to find the radius of the circle and drew it on paper. Apologies that it's so hard to see my markings for this. In the future I'll use a marker so you can see what I'm doing. Next I marked the center front, center back, and side seams of the brim. Then I started to mark out the brim width. I guessed at how big I thought it was by using reference images from the show. And here's the brim pattern laid flat. Now it was time to pattern the crown of the hat. I marked out half of the head circumference as a straight line, and then drew a rough shape of what I thought the crown looked like, again referencing images from the show. Then I added seam allowance to the bottom of the crown pattern. I used headliner foam to make my mock-up because I knew it would hold up its shape well enough to test the pattern. Because there was no seam allowance on the sides of the crown of the hat, I ended up hand sewing this part. And my husband forgot I was recording, so enjoy views of him cleaning in the background. Hi, Jet! I added wire to the brim to help hold up its shape. Here's the first mock-up fitting. You can see the crown of the hat is far too tall, and I thought the brim was just a little too wide, so I made those pattern adjustments. I made the brim half an inch shorter and then cut the excess away. Instead of making a whole new mock-up, I adjusted the one I already had by cutting away the height and adding more back if I needed. I took side-by-side photos to help me figure out the shape that I wanted. And another test fit. This is my final mock-up design that I am happy with. So I ended up shortening the brim here, so I reduced that, and I shortened the height here, and then added a little bit back in. Another thing that I had done was I had added my seam allowance to this part, so then it would fold here, but I, in the pattern for the final, am adding the seam allowance to the brim so that my seam allowance will end up in this part of the hat instead, so then you don't have to see all these little tabbies. So I'm going to be cutting it out of Fosshape soon and shaping it, and I'm really excited. I decided to use Fosshape to make this, but I needed to figure out if I wanted the 300 or the 600 thickness, so I steamed a sample of each to see which one I liked. I cut a 2 by 2 inch square of each thickness to test the shrinkage, and I ended up liking the thickness of the 600 best. Now I needed to adjust my pattern to factor in the shrinkage that would occur when steaming the Fosshape. I measured my sample at having lost 1/8 of an inch for every 1 inch. So for example, I measured my brim at 4 inches wide, and I added a little over 1/2 an inch, knowing that I could trim it later if need be. I followed the same process for the crown of the hat, and I decided to add a little seam allowance along the edges so I could overlap the pieces and hide the seam with steaming later. I machine basted my crown pieces together so it would be easier to stitch it to the brim. I wanted to hand stitch the crown to the brim so I could hide the sewing better. The Fosshape is fairly plush, and machine sewing compresses it in a way that emphasizes the stitch line when steaming that I didn't like. This took a long time, but I think it was ultimately worth it in the long run because it was really successful. I cut into the brim and tucked the seam allowance into the crown to hide the excess material, and hand sewed it down to lay flat. I prepped my head form so I could steam the Fosshape on it by padding it out to an inch bigger than my husband's head circumference to account for ease. I used quilt batting to pad it out. Then I covered the form with aluminum foil and tape to protect it from the steam. I patted at the crown of the hat before steaming it so it wouldn't cave in. Fosshape is really good at taking the shape of what it is laid against. I used polyfill and quilted cotton to stuff the crown. I started steaming the brim flat to stiffen it enough so it wouldn't flop when placed on the head form. I steamed the crown more heavily while it was stuffed to get that shaping done before placing it on the form as well. Once the Fosshape was a little more stiff, I was able to take the padding out and place it on the form to steam it further into the shape that I wanted. This part was really fun and felt like I was sculpting the material. I needed a sturdier backing to stiffen the Fosshape, so I used a silicone oven mitt to protect my hands and really pressed the steamer against the Fosshape and mitt to stiffen it further. This process took a while and I did it in stages. I would check on soft areas of the hat periodically to see if I needed to stiffen it further. I also took the hat off the form to steam the underside of the brim as well as inside the crown. It was a lot of working back and forth, making sure it was the shape and stiffness that I wanted. I tested adding texture to the Fosshape using a wood burning tool, and I ended up loving the results. I looked at reference photos to mark out where I was going to carve into the hat. Once I had all my markings done, I was ready to carve. Fosshape is a thermoplastic, so you want to make sure to do this in a well-ventilated area or wear a respirator with the proper cartridges. This is what the carving started to look like. The texture definitely helped add some depth to this. And here the carving is all done and I was ready to paint. I painted a base layer using different acrylic paints blended together to get a skin tone. I tested a few different skin tones as my base, and I also kept running out of paint, so I kept having to remix as I was going along. Because Fosshape is a felted thermoplastic, it took a long time to get the paint to get into all the little nooks and crannies, and I ended up having to paint a few layers just to get a good solid base. Here you can see the start of my painting, and you can still see a little bit of patchy white showing through, so that's why I ended up waiting till the first layer dried and then painting more layers on top of that. Then I started to paint in the carved parts with a darker paint to emphasize them. I also added some highlights and added a few washes of color to keep adding depth and texture. I used embroidery floss to add stitches along the fake seam lines for more texture. I didn't want my stitches to go through on both sides of the brim, so I used my awl to create sewing channels in the Fosshape. I was really excited this ended up working as well as it did. It helped to mark where I wanted my stitches, so they ended up looking more organic for this project. And on some of the stitches I ended up needing some heavy-duty pliers to get the needle through. Now it was time to add the feathers. The red feathers came very straight, so I ran my scissor blade along the rachis to get a more stylized curve in them, and I trimmed the ends a bit as well. I wanted a blend of the black and red feathers, so I stitched them together in a bundle, and then wrapped the base in a ribbon so it would be easier to sew to the hat later. I ended up making 2 sets of feathers so I could spread them out and make it look fuller. Then I stitched both sets of feathers to the hat. And lastly, I stitched this pin to cover up the feather bases. I couldn't find a screen accurate match for this while shopping, so I used a pin from my closet and painted over it to be black and gold, and I think it matches the aesthetic of the hat really well. Here is the final look. Carving into the Fosshape helped to add dimension when I got to the painting stage. Since this hat was not going to a customer, I did not add a lining to it. I hope this video was a helpful guide. Let me know in the comments section if you have any questions. And if you want to see more videos like this from me, feel free to like this video and subscribe to my channel.
Boy.